Okay, it is Monday, February 8th, 2016, and this is the Urbana City Council Committee of the Whole regular meeting. I'll call the meeting to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Mr. Madigan? Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Smythe?
Here.
Ms. Marlin?
Here.
Mayor Pressing? Here.
Okay, are there any additions to the agenda or staff reports? Mayor Preston?
I'm happy to announce that MetCat is going to have a 6% increase for next year's budget in the future years. They were planning 16%, but now we've got it down to 6%, so that's very good news.
Thank you. Libby?
I have two announcements. Next week, Wednesday and Thursday, there will be two screenings of the documentary called My Brooklyn. And this is being presented by the Department of Urban and Regional Planning in cooperation with many community partners, including the City of Urbana, presenting two free screenings of My Brooklyn, Demystifying Gentrification. This is a documentary about Director Kelly Anderson's personal journey as a Brooklyn gentrifier to understand the forces reshaping her neighborhood along the lines of race and class. So Wednesday at 6 p.m. there will be a screening at the Champaign Public Library, followed by a community panel, which will discuss recent development trends in Champaign-Urbana. Next Thursday, February 18th at 7:30 p.m. in Plim Auditorium at Temple Buell Hall, and that will be followed by a Q&A with the film's director. So I think this should be on our website. Secondly, and we'll get this posted as well, February 24th, coming up, we Historic Preservation Commission and City of Urbana Historic Preservation Commission and PACA, Preservation and Conservation Association of Champaign County, will be presenting a How to Research Your Old House workshop. And this will be at the Urbana Free Library in the Lewis Auditorium, 7 p.m., Wednesday, February 24th. Be presented by Alice Novak, our chair, and Brian Adams. And at the workshop, you will learn how to build the history of your house, when it was built, who designed it, who lived there, is that porch original, where was the garage, etc.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Dennis?
Boy, I think that's an excellent announcement, Libby. I know that attending a similar workshop 10 years ago is what initiated what has become most of the ordinances that we have on the books now for historic preservation.
Glad to hear it.
Okay, next we have approval of minutes of the previous meeting, January 25th, 2016. Are there any corrections?
I'll make a motion to approve them.
Second.
Been moved by Roberts, second by Ammons. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion carries. Next, we have public input. I have several people that want to talk about the MOR discussion, and that would be next after public input, so it probably makes sense just to talk during public input. But first, we'd like to hear from J. Fred Geertz, professor from IGPA, and I hear he's a great tennis player, but he's going to talk about background on the financial transaction taxes proposed.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Fred Geertz. I'm at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. I'm a Savoy resident, not a Urbana resident. I'm here. There was an expression of interest, I think, from Mayor Pressing. I have someone from the Institute or someone else at the university talk about this, and I was someone who had some expertise in the area, so I came forward. It's kind of an ambiguous situation. I'm, in a sense, representing the University of Illinois, but what I say here doesn't represent their official position when I talk about the particular proposals. So again, the topic is a financial transactions tax. I might start with an extraneous note, if I'd been asked to talk about increasing the motor fuel tax in Illinois, I would be here wholeheartedly in favor of it. I think it's a very, very good idea, and we really need revenue for infrastructure, but that's not my charge here, so I'll talk about the financial transactions tax. I'll start out by giving a little bit of background about the idea in general, then I'll bring it back home and talk about the state of Illinois. It's apropos that we talk about the financial transactions tax because one of the major proponents is James Tobin, who actually grew up in Champaign and went to Uni High, ended up at Yale and won a Nobel Prize there in economics, so has some connection to Urbana-Champaign. The idea of a financial transactions tax is twofold. The idea is to impose what appears to be a very small percentage tax on financial transactions. It could be foreign exchange trading, it could be stocks, it could be bonds, it could be any kind of financial instrument. And the goal there that Tobin brought forward was not to raise money, as a case of most taxes, but to try to somehow reduce the amount of speculation and the amount of volatility in financial markets, especially foreign exchange markets. So the original intention was not as a moneymaker, but as a way of trying to dampen volatility. There are some problems with that because all kinds of financial transactions and, in a sense, all kinds of speculation are not necessarily going to make things more unstable. For example, people buy futures contracts on food, and the result is that food in the winter doesn't go up a long ways compared to food in the summer. Oil doesn't go up a lot when it gets cold compared to when it's warm. So some kinds of transactions are, in fact, stabilizing rather than destabilizing. But there are other kinds of financial transactions that clearly could lead to destabilization. The real challenge there would be to try to figure out a way to tax the bad kind of transactions and not tax the good transactions. So that's basically the idea. Now, along with that, it has not escaped the notice of a lot of people that in addition to the main goal, the tax would also raise a substantial amount of revenue. And at the national and international level, is usually tied to some kind of aid to developing countries. There's no particular reason it has to be that way, but typically if you talk about a financial transactions tax at the United Nations, they'll be talking about it in terms of doing what I said about dampening volatility, but also using the proceeds to help the development of emerging countries. So that's basically the idea. So it's kind of the jury is out on the idea. It's never been adopted in a very comprehensive way. Not surprisingly, most financial people don't like the idea. A lot of people, especially who would like the money, do like the idea. So in terms of a national or international tax, I think you could say the jury is still out. But what I was asked to talk about here was not a worldwide tax or even a national tax, but a tax in the state of Illinois. And the game really changes substantially when you talk about a local or subnational kind of transactions tax. And the reason for that is that, first of all, it would have very little impact on the goal of the tax itself of dampening speculation and volatility, because it would only be one very small part of the whole market. So it wouldn't achieve that goal. And the second goal, which I think is the reason why Representative Flowers introduced this, was to raise money for the state of Illinois. And there's no doubt, I don't think anyone would argue that the state of Illinois could not use more money. They certainly could. The question is this a way of going about it? And my answer is going to be very likely not. It's very likely not going to be a very productive way. And the reason for that is that wanting to tax something is not the same thing as being able to tax it. For example, I assume many of you would like to have taxes levied on higher income, wealthier people and have them pay a larger share of the burden of government. But you in Urbana probably cannot do that very effectively because of the problem of mobility. If you decide to tax all millionaires at substantial rate, you wouldn't have many millionaires left in Urbana. Now, if the state of Illinois did it, it would be less of a problem. If the whole country did it, it would be even less of a problem. But for a small area, it's very difficult to do that. So the problem is that just wanting to tax something, wanting to place the burden on possibly, and the same thing would be true with the financial transactions tax, that it also might fare disproportionately on higher income people, which many people would think would be a good idea. But now comes the problem. Financial transactions are one of the most mobile activities around today. If you had a tax in Chicago, very likely most of those activities would move someplace else. It wouldn't be moving like picking up desks and chairs and file cabinets. It would be maybe clicking a switch and routing it through New York or New Jersey or someplace else, as opposed to through the city of Chicago. So the problem then is that even if you think it's a good idea, it's very unlikely it's going to raise very much money. And now I get a little bit more pointed. There was a suggestion, I think, associated with the Flowers bill, that the state of Illinois could raise $10 billion by a financial transactions tax. Well, $10 billion is 2/3 of the income tax we collect. It's more than all the sales tax we collect. It's much more than all the corporate income tax we collect. And that's simply what I would characterize as magical thinking. There's no possible way that that could raise that much money, even close to that. And let me give you kind of an example. You can say, well, it's only 0.1% or even 0.05% or something of that sort, which might be true, but when you're talking about financial transactions, the margins are extremely small. For example, there's a plan afoot to build an undersea cable from New York to the UK, eventually to London. And why are they building an undersea cable? Well, going through the cable is a millisecond faster than going up to the satellite and down to the satellite, from the satellite over to England. So they're willing to spend probably hundreds of millions of dollars to save not just a second, but even like a thousandth of a second or something of that sort, so that people in England can trade at the same level or with an even playing field with the people in New York. So even if what appears to us, if someone said a 0.1% tax on your income, you'd say, well, that's practically nothing, which it is. But that same thing on millions and billions of financial transactions actually has much more of an impact. So the bottom line is that regardless of what you think about a financial transactions tax for the world or for the United States, it's probably not going to be a very productive thing for the state of Illinois.
Okay.
Are you having any questions? Or?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Gertz?
Yeah, we heard a presentation. Carol Ammons had a gentleman who talked about the trillions of dollars that are traded, and he was talking about a $2 tax on one type of transaction,
right,
and a $1 tax on agriculture. And the first thing that comes to mind, would the exchanges just move? And he said it wouldn't be on the exchanges, it's on the trade, and that all these transactions go through many, many computers that are located in Aurora, Illinois. So it would be very expensive for them to switch.
Right.
So
Well,
he was countering that argument. So are there economists that are looking at this that think it would work at the local level?
Well, again, I don't spend a lot of my time dealing with financial transactions taxes, but I think the answer is probably no, because again, if you're thinking about raising $10 billion, you can move a lot of computers for $10 billion a year. So I would suspect that even in the short run, it might actually generate some money. I think it's $1 per agricultural instrument traded, or $2 for others. But eventually, if you're running up $10 billion a year in taxes, I would think that people are going to think about finding ways to avoid that. Now, again, it's not necessarily because you or I wouldn't want to do that, or wouldn't want to collect the money. It's that it's really not going to be very easy to do that. Even something much, much simpler than that is collecting sales tax on retail purchases over the internet. That seems to be very straightforward, very easy, very traceable, and so on. And it's been 20 years now. We haven't really accomplished that yet. So I wouldn't want to minimize the difficulty in trying to do this.
Eric?
Yeah, so, I'm not sure how to formulate this into a question. I've been also thinking about this since it appeared on our agenda, and have, you know, what you're saying confirms my thinking about it. I guess the only, I just can't, is there any way, okay, is there any way to get what I was trying to think about, and I just couldn't, is there any way to get a piece of, you know, a tiny little piece of all of this trading action that would not have the, would not suffer from the problem that, as you say, if it's going to raise any appreciable amount of money, if that money is more than the cost of moving the computers across the state line, that you know, you're dead. So I can't think of any way around that. But have you heard anybody talk about that?
Well, I can make up a story, but the story probably doesn't have political legs. If you did it at the national level or even the international level, and then divided up the money and sent it back to the states, kind of a revenue sharing arrangement, you could probably do that. But it's not very unlikely, given the federal government's financing issues. They're going to raise a tax and then give it away back to the states. And again, I don't think I made this clear. I don't think anyone's talking about a Urbana financial transactions tax. They're talking about supporting one in the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois is obviously a large state, 12 or 13 million people, a fifth of 5% of the national economy. But even there, it would be very difficult to do that.
Actually, do let me ask you a question then, because national transactions tax has been discussed recently. Do you, and you've said that this would be more feasible than state. Is more feasible mean that it probably would be economically and technically feasible?
I guess I think it would be, but there would be a cost involved, and again, it would be offshore rather than moving from Illinois to and there have to be ways. Again, I'm not a person who knows about I mean, I know about tax administration, but I don't know about administering a tax like this is largely on the internet and so on. So I think I'm sure it could be done, but if it could be done easily or quickly is another question.
Diane, did you still have something?
No, I changed my mind.
Mayor?
We supposedly had a national financial transaction tax until the 1960s, and New York State still has one, but they now refund it to the exchanges.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with why we got rid of it in the 1960s?
I think I think the reason why New York couldn't do it was because of New Jersey. That there was a move afoot to move things across the Hudson River and locate them in New Jersey rather than New York. I'm not sure about the national. I don't. To be honest, there was never any substantial. There may have been some minor tax, but the thing we're talking about here is quite different from those kind of things. The things I've read, someone said you could raise $120 billion a year nationally, or $11 billion a year just in Chicago. And again, I think that's not a tiny thing. The thing that you're talking about is probably a very, very small kind of add-on that didn't have much impact.
Okay. Oh, as long as you're here, we have also the gasoline tax to talk about. So we do need more money for infrastructure. Yeah. Could you comment on what the effect on the economy would be? I know you do the flash index, but
well, tax. You know, if someone swoops down and takes away tax money and throws it away or sends it to some other place, it's bad. But if you use tax money to do good things, the good things could very well more than balance the cost of the taxes. So infrastructure is one of the key things that help cities and states and so on to be economically viable. So a gasoline tax would be returned in terms of better transportation. I would prefer roads and subways and things of that sort, not necessarily high-speed rail, but regardless, those kind of things would actually help the Illinois economy, and my guess would be that the good done by the infrastructure development would far exceed the cost of the tax. I've been very disappointed both in Illinois and nationally over the past 25 or 30 years. We haven't had a national gasoline tax increase since the early 1990s, and during that period of time we've had huge increases in fuel economy, a big increase in the price of gasoline until recently, and so revenues have been pretty much stagnant. And the same thing has been true in Illinois. We haven't stepped up, and again, if there's any tax you could support, it seems to me this would be a tax that would be reasonable. And the disappointment continues. I think most people are happy about the fact that the new head of the Ways and Means Committee was able to negotiate a deal with the Senate and the President to pass a transportation bill. But even with that, they again avoided the hard issue. What they did was to take some kind of surplus from the Federal Reserve and recycle that back into transportation, which makes no sense at all, but it was a way of avoiding the gasoline tax. So even at the federal government level, they haven't been willing to step forward and raise the price, even though I think it's a reasonable thing. And it's kind of like a 2 or 3 for 1. First of all, you get the revenue. Secondly, you get better infrastructure. Thirdly, you may have some impact on congestion and even on carbon usage, things of that sort. So all these things kind of go together, and it seems like a no-brainer, but it certainly hasn't been up to this point.
You would have more jobs too, right?
In my opinion, we would.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And thanks for that clarification. Yes, these are not Urbana taxes we're proposing. These are things that will be coming up in our legislative discussion later that the mayor has a report on. I also have an input from Bishop King James and Reverend Dr. Evelyn Underwood. They do not wish to address the committee, but ask that their position be entered into the record. They're continually concerned about the Dr. Ellis sewer problem. Next, I have Rich Cahill. Did you want to speak now?
Well, sure a lot quieter than it was last Monday night. I was going to give you a little background about myself. I moved to Champaign-Urbana in 1974, and I bought my first house in 1975 on 807 West Clark, and I also had the adjacent 809. And at the time, I was 25 years old, and I could afford a $22,000 house. And I didn't really think about where it was and what the zoning was and anything about that. And I think at some point, if I looked out my front door at 807, I was about 5 different zonings in that block. And then I learned early on that, well, Clark Street and 800 block was sort of the buffer that saved or protected or the Main Street corridor. And it was the block just to the north of Main, and there were a lot of substantial houses along Main. And so long years go by, and 1989 or so became the downtown to campus plan. Well, the 800 block of Clark Street was the extreme northern boundary of that area. And Eric will remember, it seemed like once every year there was another proposal by a certain developer. He had a plan for that 800 block of Clark Street. And we went on and on and on. I don't remember how many hearings I went to and how many times I talked to Lonnie Clark, who was our rep at the time. So years go by, and 1998 my lifestyle changed and I wanted to upgrade. So I decided, well, looked around, looked at a lot of houses, Champaign-Urbana, and we settled on a house in 1988 in 307 South Orchard. And once again, you looked around, I could afford this house. It went from instead of a $20,000 house, now it was an $80,000 house. And I look, across the street's Tina Gonzalez, a nice house. And the other side is the Corkeries that worked for News Gazette. And across the street was Rental. And another side was rental, but at the time, it didn't matter. It was, new neighbors every year. And it was a relatively stable area. Well, in 1990 or so, it became, up comes the MOR district that kind of supplemented the downtown district. And so the very first case that I remember was at 611 Green Street, which was the Ricker House. And I was just getting involved with PACA at the time, and the Bar Real Estate was going to develop the lot. And it came up to MOR was just starting. It came up to a vote at the Zoning Board of Appeals. The vote was 3-2 to deny the application for demolition of the Ricker House. At that point, thanks to some creative loans, PACA was able to buy the house in about 95, and by the year 2000, we had restored that house and sold it to the first of 3 single families that lived in the house. The first families were the Taylors. They were new. She was a new professor in what used to be called home ec. It's got a more correct title now. And her husband was finishing his MBA. Things didn't work out here. They went to the University of Arizona, where she got another decent good job. The next family was there for a few years, and the third family, once again, new faculty member, escaping Texas A&M, originally from Penn State, and they set up a family at the Ricker House. In the early days, the Ricker House, the 600 block of Green was under, we used to, as Steve Ross, Matt Taylor, and the 3 of us, we were called, it seemed like every month we were going to another MOR meeting. And at the time, MOR was just city staff. And the first proposal was to develop 611, Ricker House is 612, 611 Green Street, and then that first proposal was rejected. A few years later, they came back with a second proposal that was accepted and was a lot less intrusive than what had originally proposed by the architect. 601 and 605 Green were 2 very badly run down grooming houses, to say, or 601 especially was it was a fire trap. And partially because of the MOR and some design review, instead of just a tear down, those 2 houses were redeveloped. They're fitting in the neighborhood, they fit in the scale, and they don't enhance the neighborhood, but they stabilize the neighborhood. Across the street, the First Presbyterian Church tore down the original parsonage and built an addition to the Korean church, which is very much in keeping with their existing church. I decided Sunday before Super Bowl to take a little walk. So you walked out my house, walked down 700 block. 701 West Green was also one of the early MOR cases. And what Cochran put up is a very tasteful building. It's got a lot of stonework. About 6 units in there. As you walk on down the street, you eventually get all the way down to 714, and that was a former Quaker house. Right to the 712 was a great infill done by Hunziker. So again, the MOR and some design review kept the character, kept things going. I continue my strolls, and you get up to the 600 block and the 400 block, and I think staff eventually could easily prepare with their GIS technology overlay of the properties and what they were when the ordinance went in effect and what they are today. But I would say there's very few owner-occupied structures along the Green Elm corridor. The 500 block has a number of small houses that could go. Also the 700 block. 300 block, by the time you get that far east of Elm, you've got a few nice houses in there, and then you got some little, I call them little shoe boxes, that are, all the entries are 90 degrees to the street. So it's a lot of mixed, but I think the MOR needs to be strengthened. I think it's a fragile neighborhood, and I think if you just take the approach of let's just downzone it all to R2 or whatever, you're kind of taking away the right to maybe develop. If you keep it at MOR, but you maybe make the process a little bit clearer, you can keep this 6-7 block area relatively intact, and not just make it look like, let's say, Springfield Avenue or some other parts just to the north. I think that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Cahill? Next is Esther Pat.
Thank you. I'm Esther Pat. I live at 706 South Kohler Avenue, and I've lived in West Urbana for 40 years. When I moved into the neighborhood in 1975, the West Urbana Neighborhood Association was already beginning to be active because homeowners in the neighborhood were very concerned about the deterioration of the neighborhood, and up until then what seemed to be the lack of interest from the city administration in preserving it. And there definitely was push from some developers to just have the east side of the campus be like the west side of the campus, which of course they were never the same, and there are so many very well maintained as well as quite a few large expensive homes just east of Lincoln Avenue that it would be kind of stupid really to just let the whole thing run down. There were a number of different things that happened between 1975 and 1989, but the biggie in 1989, and I think this is what precipitated more than anything the creation of the MOR district, was a beautiful large home with lots of green space around it near Orchard and Elm was destroyed by fire. It was one of the Busey mansions, and it was replaced with the Campus Oaks apartment complex. The complex takes up an entire city block from Orchard to McCullough and from Green to Elm, and it is 32 four-bedroom apartments. And it's built, in the modern kind of style that, isn't really compatible with the houses. And that really got folks going, and that triggered the Downtown to Campus plan, or study, which resulted, I believe it was in June of '92 that the Downtown to Campus plan was adopted. The primary element of it, from some people's point of view, was the downzoning. And there were people in our neighborhood who wanted everything from Maine to Florida and from Lincoln to Race to just be downzoned to R2, single family, or from Michigan to Florida is actually R1, east of Busey, but basically single family, and just have a whole bunch of non-conforming uses. The planning staff, of course, pointed out that that's not the best way to approach planning, is to call something R2 when there are so many multifamily uses already in there. And what they came up with was a compromise, I suppose. South of Green Street and east of Busey is all R2, or, as I said, R1. And then they took the area that is now the MOR district, basically Green Street and Elm, and created this MOR district, mixed office residential. And if you look at the definition of MOR in the zoning ordinance, you'll see its purposes were to preserve the existing housing stock and to make sure that new development was compatible to the existing uses, the older houses and whatnot. And that was certainly because there were people, as Rich said, if you just had no development in that whole area, that might not be such a good idea. Well, again, if you look at the zoning map, you can see how the business and the residential and the high-density residential along Springfield Avenue, the discussion as part of the campus downtown plan was that new development should be on Springfield, not on Green, and that Green should maintain its residential profile, and that's how they came up with MOR. And the O in there, the idea was adaptive reuse. There was maybe a fantasy that a lot of, the problem is we got a lot of these big houses, and they were over-occupied. Landlords were renting them to, 8 and 10 students, which they weren't supposed to do, and people saying, but big houses aren't viable as single-family homes. How many people are going to buy these big houses, especially after they've been worn down and poorly maintained for 20 years? And so there was a hope that people might, especially as you get close to downtown, people might want to redevelop the houses as offices. And there actually, I think, are 4 office uses, or there was one some kind of commercial business, I don't know what it is now, and 2 offices and the Christian Counseling Center were all developments after MOR district was created. But as Rich mentioned, I won't repeat all that, the different properties where people wanted to build, there were concerns about what was going to be built. Part of the MOR restrictions, which I think are probably the most important, are the limit on square feet. I believe a building can't be more than 5,800 square feet or thereabouts, something just under 6,000. And there also are height limits and floor area ratio and setback. Unfortunately, from the perspective of some of us in the neighborhood, the city it doesn't always. It seems the zoning board of approval seems to just always approve people's requests for variances on height and whatnot. So some of those buildings, like 701 West Green, is lovely, but they got a variance on height, and the 611 something too. There's one property in the MOR district that I think a new construction that is consistent with what the vision was, and that is 712 West Green, which was built by Kevin Hunsinger. It's a 3-story, 5-unit apartment building. I know that's what's planned for 611 West Elm, and I sure hope that's what ends up being. And likewise with the Busey corridor, the whole idea was we couldn't say Lincoln Avenue was R2. That was just silly. So it was laid out to sort of be, it's not even really a buffer, but they downsized, and Charlie Smythe, who sadly is not here because of family business, kept him away, but he was on the city council when it was, he's here, I know, I'm sorry, he's here. Remote. He was on the city council when they did the study and adopted the plan in the 89 to 93 time, and I know the Busey corridor. It was a property by property zoning decision on that map. They downzoned to the lowest use. So if something was a small apartment building, it got to be R4, not R5. So if it gets torn down, only an R4 can be built, not an R5, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that. I don't know whether you're planning on doing, if you're planning on doing anything, you just wanted to discuss this. I'll just point out the big controversy last week was historic preservation, and that's a whole different topic. And that ordinance was passed in 1998. And all the issues, most of the issues in the MOR district have not been that type of issue where it was one of historic preservation. It was really just a matter of what development is going to, Dave Barr owned 611 West Green, what was he going to do with it? And if he was going to tear down the house that was there and build something new, would it fit in? So I just hope whatever you do, if you do anything at all, that you just keep in mind that the primary goal for MOR, and actually even the Busey corridor too, which is why their design review criteria is to is to have development that is compatible with the single-family neighborhood in which it exists, and though they don't say anything about historic, but that is made up of older structures that are, and a whole lot of the neighborhood was built before 1930, and that's worth, and definitely before 1950, and that's worth preserving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, Eric?
I was not paying enough attention when the MOR was drafted, so maybe you could tell me why was it designed in such a way that MOR decisions don't come to the city council? Because other, all kinds of other decisions like this do.
Of course, that wasn't my first choice, but I was not on the council at the time. Originally, the idea was that the only things that would go, if someone builds something, they don't need to come to the city council. They just get a building permit. So in the MOR district, it's changing the zoning of the underlying land. And so there's no reason to go to the city council unless you're asking for a zoning change, which wouldn't be the case with MOR. The variances go to the zoning board of appeals. They don't come to city council. And so there was really no initially what was created, there was no need for any approval other than the building permit, and then, like I said, people wanted variances. I don't remember what year it was, but when I was on the city council, so sometime between 1994 and 2005, we created the Development Review Board in order to have some extra level of review other than just building by right. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was that, and the board was because it's not a permission. If you own 611 West Green, you have a right to build whatever you want on 611 West Green as long as it's within
Right.
within codes and zoning. So that was why it wasn't something that had to go to city council, because it's just building by right. And in fact, the people who think everything is a taking that has anything to do with the city controlling what people do, which we've wanted, we've wanted appellate court on that, and the city has, you've won on that. But I think the idea was to put some level of review on the design just to make sure that it really does fit in with the neighborhood.
Because I got legally sandbagged on this, because when the issue first came to my attention, based on both my own principles and constituents, I expressed my view to the MOR board, which didn't pose any issue with respect to adjudicatory review. And then, when essentially the same issue went to the Historic Preservation Commission, I was told that now I had forfeited my voice and vote on the issue.
Well, my personal opinion is that you don't really forfeit your voice and vote. Anyone who told you that, I think, was wrong. But and I suppose it was the city attorney, and they'll have to argue about it. But I don't think that's the case. But that's because there were two different cases for 611 West Elm. One was, it was MOR, just the owner wanted to develop, and so normally, he would just have to get a building permit, but because it was an MOR district, he also had to go before the Development Review Board. And that's all there was. Then the petition was filed, or I don't know what the timing was, but since the petition was filed for historic designation, which is a totally different issue than MOR, that did have to go to the Historic Preservation Commission and then come to City Council. And so that's, so there were really just two things going on there. But as I said, most of the time in MOR district, you haven't had both of those.
Yeah.
Or in the case of, or that in this order, I guess 502, I think that you folks, most of you were, I think, on the City Council when 502, 504 West Elm were up for historic preservation designation. And there, the owner had filed a demolition permit but had not yet submitted anything for MOR, so I don't think it ever went, if I remember that correctly, it never went through the MOR. You just dealt with the historic designation, and then you designated, and in one case it was unanimous, which is unusual in this council for historic designations, but it was such a compelling argument. But that's, so I don't know if that clarifies it for you, just those were two different things going on at 611 West Elm. Had there been no petition for historic preservation designation, you would not, it would have never come to you, because it would have just been someone building a building on property they own.
Thank you. Dennis?
And you flashed past, I think, maybe something worth mentioning, and that was that the city had actually gone to court concerning what a taking was.
Well, that was actually that was on historic preservation. The most recent one was. Oh no, it wasn't on historic. We did on historic, but no, actually, it was also on the down zoning. 807 West Main. Howard Wakeland owned the building, and he wanted to build something that was not. He wanted to build a 32-unit building or something, and zoning doesn't allow that there, and he sued the city for down zoning him in the campus to downtown plan, and it was about 10 years after the rezoning that he filed that suit, and he lost, and then he appealed to the appellate court, and he lost in the appellate court, and my understanding from the city attorney at the time was that there were a lot of case law in Illinois and other places throughout the country, that cities have the right to down zone to maintain the profile of a neighborhood without it being considered a taking, and I think they're similar for historic preservation as well. But I'm not an expert on that, but if it ever comes up, I'm sure the city attorney can tell you about that. Okay. And I'm not a lawyer either, so.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Danny Otto.
My name's Danny Otto. I'm at 405 West Illinois Street, Urbana, and I serve on both the Urbana Plan Commission and the MOR, but I'm here speaking for myself, not representing either of those bodies. I hope that none of the review of this goes too far without getting serious input from Carolyn Baxley, who I believe was on council when the original MOR was set up, and then she was on the MOR in 2003 when there were revisions done to the process. And she is a walking historian of the MOR as well as the neighborhood, and she couldn't be here tonight, but I think her voice would be very, very important. Reference was already made to the purpose of the MOR, that the purpose of the new district would be to allow a variety of residential, office, and commercial uses in the district, but to encourage the adaptive reuse of existing structures. The plan stressed that as an incentive to adaptively reuse existing structures, a wider variety of uses should be permitted. I've thought a lot about this recently, and like Rich Cahill, I walk the neighborhood all the time, going to and fro. And you know, I think there should be some reconsideration of the desirability of offices or the viability of offices on those two quarters. Green Street has no parking, and so for any office or commercial use, there's no parking. You're going to have to tear down a house in order to create parking, which is going to work against the district. And right now, it makes much more sense for offices to relocate in downtown Urbana than it does on Green Street. Elm Street is a different sort of a street because it ends in a T before it gets out to Lincoln. So it's a quieter street. You don't have the through traffic. And if you're going to be a business, to have a business on that street with a sign up, you know, doesn't make much sense. I know there's a resale shop associated with the church, but that's a different sort of enterprise than someone who wants to do insurance or law or something and have some visibility. Elm Street doesn't make a whole lot of sense in most of that. So it seems to me like residential is the most obvious use there, and then the question becomes what's appropriate. The process now, the way it's structured, in the recent case, which has provoked a lot of controversy, I don't want to relitigate the case, but the process, I mean, by the time it got to us in the hearing, there was a strong sense that the applicant had worked very, very closely with city staff to design a building that met the criteria. And I sort of felt like there were two applicants, that the city staff was invested because of the time they had spent with the designer and the applicant, that, you know, when we ask questions about, you know, how does this judgment fit in with this and so on, there was so much investment in this will work that it made it very, very difficult. I felt uncomfortable with it. So, you know, one possibility would be if an applicant had a kind of conceptual plan without all of the details. So we had a preliminary hearing, and the design review board had a chance to talk about it, and they could hear from us, and then we would be more involved in it. But it really felt like at that point in the process, there was huge sort of, made it very difficult, I think, to say no or to ask for revisions. In my mind, the single biggest problem that gives an incentive for a tear down is the higher density. So if that were R2 or R3, the area density would be 40%, and the MOR at 70. So if you're trying to maximize your revenue, I mean, so you could have take a house and turn it into a duplex, or you could tear down the house, build something much larger, and maximize your revenue. So the underlying land value at that density goes up, and then there's no incentive to maintain the house and use it in line with its historic usage. So the single tweaking that I think would have a big effect is to, if the house was originally a single-family resident, treat the density as R3. There are several things in there that were originally a 4-flat or a 6-flat. Treat those as an R4. And then you get away from this. You're actually giving incentive to tear down. I mean, it's not always a tear down. Rich didn't address this, but the house that backs up to him, I think it's 601 Green. That's an adaptive reuse that became quite controversial several years ago, but the way that house was added on to and porches filled in, it doesn't retain the character of the original house, and by the time they maxed out to the 70% and then needed parking, the open area is all paved other than a very narrow strip between the sidewalk and the front steps. So that really changed the character of that, and it does affect, when that happens on Green Street, it affects the people living on High Street because they're backing up to that, and rather than having a backyard next to you, you've got a paved parking lot. So I think take a close look at altering the 70% coverage area works against maintaining and using the current structures.
Thank you very much. Dennis?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. So, so you brought up the experience at, I think was you said 601 Green, where altering the different sides of the house enlarged the structure so it was no longer seemingly compatible with the surrounding
I wasn't on the
structures?
MOR at that time. I have nothing to do with that other than I became aware of the sort of issues because of public discussion.
Right.
But that house was expanded, and it was allowed to be expanded so that you get the 70% ratio, rather than if it was R3, it would have been 40%.
And then, as I recall, one of the issues that came up in Mr. Cahill's mind about that as well was that 4 different variances were allowed, and none of them were reviewed by a board.
Yeah, I don't have any involvement. I don't have any opinions on that. I mean, I see what's there. I walk by it, and I think about the reason that current structure is there. It's true. Underneath that is the historic house, but not that one would know it. So technically, it's adaptive reuse, but the incentive was actually to add on to it in such a way that
To maximize.
probably it would have been more attractive to do what was done at, 701? Tear it down and build a nice brick structure. I mean, so what's there? I mean, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't know who owns the building, but it's sort of the worst of all possible worlds. But another possibility would have been that the owner would have maintained that building and used it in line with a kind of R3 designation.
Okay, Mayor Pressing.
Would you explain the 70% again, please?
Yeah, if you look at the zoning districts, MOR maximum floor area ratio is 70%. The minimum open space ratio is 30%. So at least 30% of the lot size, I take it, has to be open, but that can be parking. And then if you go to R3, the maximum floor area is 40%. So that's, in MOR, you can have, 175%? Who's the mathematician in the room? Of what it would be in R3. Then the minimum open space ratio is 40%. So when you have got an R3, you have to have more open space. So those two things work together. By the time you have the maximum sort of apartment building on there at the 70%, you essentially have got to pave everything else, which is still open space, but it's parking. And so if you have to have 40% open space, then that's going to, even apart from the 70%, it's going to let you turn less of it into parking. So those two things really work against the residential character of the neighborhood in my mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Charlie here. Danny, if I could ask a real quick question. What do you think the impact of the MCOR project, redoing Green Street from campus to Race Street, and potential of MTD, say, doing bus rapid transit on Springfield could have for the neighborhood?
I didn't come prepared to address that, sorry. I'd have to think about it. But I think my larger point is when one looks at the trends, so this has been in place now since 1991, the market for office space on the Green Street corridor is probably not there. And we're probably wiser to direct that to other places where we have more vacant land. It looks to me like the residential character of that corridor from Cedar down to Lincoln, or at least the service stations that you get down there, is probably fixed.
Eric?
So you mentioned the staff report in the case that we just dealt with. How would you respond to the notion that perhaps the staff should lay out the pluses and minuses of the array of options that, with regard to actions that the commission should take, and just let you sort through all of that without a staff recommendation?
Well, I have more experience with staff cases on the Urbana Plan Commission, and there they do come always with a recommendation, but the Plan Commission constantly tweaks, alters, sometimes rejects, not that often, but there's a lot more give and take. But it felt like in this case, and we don't have many cases, so we had one other that also shows there's some problems here. So a homeowner on Elm Street wanted to build a garage and had to go through and do a case to get a permit to build a garage. Well, he's investing in a single family. It's in a 400 block on the north side. It shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't have to come to us to do a garage. So there's things about this that probably are overly burdensome in some ways, and then things about it also that don't actually work very well to achieve the goal that was set out. But
So there's probably, so with respect to the question that I posed, there's probably not a formulaic answer.
I don't think there's a formulaic answer, but I felt we were sort of boxed in
In
a way that
particular case,
I don't typically feel that on the Plan Commission, which has different sets of issues typically. But in this case, the design criteria, when is a patio a porch?
Yeah.
What is the street face of the building on a corner lot? All of, those sorts of things. And,
Right.
I felt like staff was invested in the design and defended the design rather than, I don't know. But I don't want to relitigate that. I mean, that's done.
No, we all we want to do is just learn the right lessons from it for going forward in the future,
Yeah, but I think probably the biggest incentive on that was to maximize the revenue, and the way to do that was to start with an empty lot and build it out. They actually didn't go to quite 70%, but it was 65% or something. But, again, with the parking requirements and so on, you might not actually be able to achieve the...
Okay, thank you. We do have a staff report coming up on this. I have one more.
1 minute. 601 Green came up.
Okay. Come on, Rich. Tell us about 601 Green real quick.
I didn't want to really bring it up because that was a sore subject in my household, but it did get a lot of attention. I don't know, where your front page, and the reporter happens to be sitting at the desk, and a photographer comes up and says, please don't smile, Rich, put on your pouty face. But essentially the footprint of It took us 6 to get used to it. But the biggest thing was how to process what we didn't like. What went in its place, it's essentially the same footprint. They ripped off some of the crap. It's about the same distance to the street. Yes, it's parking all the way. We hear car doors slam. But before that, it was a rundown party house. There's bands upstairs. Now you don't see anybody. You hear doors close and come and go. But in the 2008, I would never admit that to Libby, but it's better now than what was there. And the owner of that house was had no intention of fixing it up, didn't see any revenue in fixing it up. It was a fire trap. So aesthetically, it does look better. There's more people there, but there's really less people. And it's never fully occupied because there's so much rental space out there. These are like little shoeboxes in there. There's 16 kids in there, but they're never fully rented. So this is going to be another issue. There's going to be so many units out there, there are not going to be people to fill them.
Okay, thank you. I had one input by email from Brian Adams. I can read that. Unfortunately, I can't attend tonight's City Council meeting due to a prior commitment. I would like to submit the following regarding City Council decision related to landmark nomination and tonight's discussion of the MOR. I'm concerned that although the MOR district was created to encourage the adaptive reuse of older buildings to retain the historic appearance of the area, this is rarely, if ever, included in discussions of cases before the MOR Design Review Board. I don't believe city staff took this into serious consideration when evaluating the recent plans for 611 West Elm, and I believe only one member of the Design Review Board brought it up when evaluating the plans. For those who are aware of this aspect of the district, it is deceptive and misleading, as it never seems to be a topic of discussion. It misleads people into thinking that the district is meant to encourage the preservation of its older structures, some of which have already been designated local landmarks. Views presented by the public in support of adaptive reuse and preservation in this area are typically ignored or dismissed by city staff, as well as attorneys paid to speak against the concept of adaptive reuse. And then we also were forwarded an email from September from Alice Novak that was to the MOR Design Review Board that was pretty similar, just I won't read the whole thing, just concerned about encouraging adaptive reuse, basically, and what that means in respect to the MOR. So we have a presentation from Libby Tyler.
If I could jump in, I have to get going.
Okay.
And I just wanted to make a couple of comments before.
Okay, go ahead.
And then I'll come back and listen to the tape of the show. Is that okay?
Yes, Charlie Smythe.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I think the zoning changes in the Busey-Lincoln corridor were extremely important and were very successful in that there's some stabilization of that area. I think there's some definition there. By having Busey be R2 as much as possible on the west side, it created backyard to backyard transitions between R2 and the higher density, as much as we possibly could. MOR has been a little bit more problematic, but underneath all of this is the issue that we've got several neighborhoods that are walkable and livable right now between campus and downtown. This is a very sustainable model. It's good for downtown. It's good for people. And these sorts of neighborhoods are built around parks and schools. But over time, with population growth and the demands, we probably need to add a bit of density instead of sprawling out into the suburbs. So I think that's sort of the crux of this, is how do you add to that density? So I'm a little concerned, that we I want to take into consideration, and as we go forward, the improvements that are planned to Green Street to Race, because I think those are going to encourage some development and redevelopment. If we put bus rapid transit on Springfield, with Springfield as a target for higher density development, then Springfield as a target for higher density development makes more sense than doing it on Green. So I think any tweaks that we come up with should be to enhance the work we've done in the past and these ideas and concepts. And I'm going to try to listen in, but I have to get going, and I'll stay in contact as much as I can, but I won't be speaking any longer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Okay, Libby Tyler.
I put together just a short presentation on some of the background, and I've got some visuals of a lot of the addresses that have been mentioned already. I've got some visuals of those. Really want to thank the really helpful context that was provided by people who have been in the area for a long time. Rich Cahill, Esther Pat, Danny Otto lived in the area and have observed these changes through the years, have some personal experiences, so that really helps. And of course, Esther was on council for many of these changes, and Charlie as well, for the initial motivation for this district. So I want to thank them for that background. I think before getting into some of the history, it would be helpful to just review together what the purpose of the district today in our zoning ordinance. And also we put together packets of information for you, and what we copied was the case history. We did this for both MOR and the Lincoln-Busey corridor, the case history of the development design reviews in those two areas. And I've excerpted the sections of the zoning ordinance. I know the zoning ordinance is super long, so we've excerpted the sections that pertain to the MOR and Lincoln-Busey. And we also have the handy-dandy zoning description sheet, which is really a great tool to kind of at a glance understand what a district's about and what the different uses are that are permitted. So here I bolded some of the items in the current purpose from our zoning ordinance. The mixed office residential district is intended to, this is the first sentence, to encourage a mixture of residential, office, and small-scale business land uses that are limited in scale and intensity and designed and constructed to be compatible with this existing structures in the district. So the first sentence tells us there's a range of uses, they're limited in scale and intensity, and they're going to be designed in a special way. The second sentence tells us the district is intended to encourage the adaptive reuse of existing older structures through incentives that will extend the useful life of such structures. What are those incentives? I have a little more information later on, but basically that would allow for an expedited review, administrative review, number one, so you don't have the pain and agony of going to a board meeting or council meeting. It is difficult for some people to do that. And then the other important incentive is that the DRB can grant variances because it's difficult to adaptively reuse some of these structures for modern building code and other site development needs. Third sentence, new construction shall be designed and constructed in a manner that's consistent with the character of the district. And hence we have the design guidelines. And we talk further about protecting nearby residential uses by limiting the scale and intensity. It's appropriate for mixed uses on small sites, which need a careful evaluation of use-to-use compatibility. So that's a current definition. It has evolved from when it was first established, but that's what we're working with today. Where is it? I think most of you know, but I've got a map here. It's the blue color. So it encompasses really 3 corridors. We've got Green Street, and that's the most prominent corridor. And that's the link between, the major link between our downtown and campus. So it's an important corridor. And it also has Elm Street, which is a different character kind of corridor. Not as houses are different scale perhaps. There are not as many of the office uses. And then there's the west side of Race Street, just south of the library area. So we have kind of three sections of MOR. So it's not an overlay, it's an actual zone. So what are some of the key elements of the MOR zone? Well, you can see in your zoning description sheet there are a ton of different business and residential uses that you can use in the MOR. So the city's open to a range of uses in these important corridors. who are interested in, it could be any kind of office, a hair salon, a thrift store. It could be a single-family home. It could be a duplex. It could be an apartment building. It's a very permissive zone in terms of uses, but it is very restrictive in terms of development regulations. Compared to the other non-residential zones, maximum height of 35 feet. Front yard is the same as our other residential zones. It's 15 feet as averaged against the block face, so it can actually go up to as much as 25 feet. And as Danny Otto was explaining, the FAR is also low for a non-residential zone. It's 0.7. So that means you could have 0.7 of the land area could be contained in floor area, including all floors. So if it was one story, it would be 70% roughly of the land area. But the hook here in the MOR is that can only be applied, your FAR permission can only be applied to 8,500 square feet of your land area. And I think Esther mentioned this as well. So that gives you just shy of 6,000 square feet of building area. So why do we have that? We have that to prevent lot consolidation like Campus Oaks. It's a very clever and effective regulation to limit the scale and the size of new development. So lots of use choices, scale and size, not so much. Another add-on to this zone that you don't find in other places, and it was the first in Urbana and Champaign, was you need to follow design guidelines. Most places you don't need to do that. This was the first. This was the first place in our 2 cities where we applied design guidelines. In its first iteration, it was simply site plan review at the staff level. We've continued to improve this zone, and that evolved into our board that actually looks at design, and we created a package of design guidelines, which you also have a copy in your packet, to help guide the developers and the board in reviewing, and the staff if it's an administrative review. In addition to the guidelines, so guidelines are, here's like a pattern book of things we'd like you to follow. They're guidelines. There's lots of choices. Mix your materials. It's about mixing materials. It's not this shall be brick or hardy board or whatever. You're going to mix these materials. These are preferred materials. But in addition to that, we have some mandatory requirements that are in the zoning ordinance. Mandatory to follow the guidelines. Guidelines give you choices, but mandatory, and the council felt strongly about this at the time, that we must see the entrance to the building on the street side. And this was a reaction to some earlier designs that had blank facades or that you really couldn't tell, it didn't have a residential appearance. And we also want to see window openings on the street side, and we want to see parking behind the front face of the building. We don't want parking lots in front, and we really want to get away from the building on stilts look, where you look at the lot and you just see the underbuilding parking. That can also detract from the character. Adaptive reuse with no more than a 15% increase, it's a small increase in the building footprint, can be reviewed administratively. That's an incentive. That is something that is beneficial to people in time and resources, and those variances can be really important in getting a project to fit on a site so they can retain the building. So we have built in important incentives for adaptive reuse in this ordinance. I think they're working since we made that modification. We've seen a lot more adaptive reuse than we had before. Here is our current MOR review board. Danny Otto is here tonight. He's appointed. And in the zoning ordinance, you'll see these are like the cast of characters that must be in the MOR review board. So it's no longer the staff review. And this was something I was the first to really push this, because I think these are important decisions to be made by the stakeholders. So Danny's our plan commissioner. Kim Smith's our historic preservation commissioner. It's beneficial to have Kim there as well because she's an architect, and we're, after all, looking at design. So it's helpful to have that background. Danny has a lot of construction and design experience as well. Then we have our chair, Jeff Poss, is a licensed architect, faculty at the University of Illinois, does a fantastic job for us. A newer member, Jonah Weiskopf. Jonah's on our zoning board, and he owns a number of properties in the MOR. A lot of, I guess, not so much adaptive reuse, but, you know, he retains the residential structures and uses them as a boarding house model, which is allowed in the MOR, and he's also an owner-occupant. We have tried very hard to find resident members. It's been, most often when we have vacancies on the MOR, it's because we are not able to get residents in the MOR, even near the MOR, to serve on the board. And we have gone so far as to send direct mail to all eligible people. So maybe tonight, folks listening will, you know, hear that we have one opening here and 2 on the Lincoln Busey one, and would be willing to help us out because we do want the resident perspective. Our developer is Scott Kunkel. Scott is with JSM Apartments. He's also an architect. And our small business owner is Matt Cho. And Matt also lives quite close to the MOR as well. So they do have a tough job. We don't have that many cases, but they are very diligent and they serve the city well. Here's that timeline. So this document, I brought this, I found it in our library. This is a really important planning document. I think that the city of Urbana should be really proud of this document. So it was 1990, so we're talking more than a quarter century ago. We were very forward thinking and taking a look at what was dynamics of what was happening between our residential areas and the campus and the pressures that were really undermining some of our residential areas and resulting in development scale and intensity that was not compatible. And the one of the outcomes of this forward-thinking plan was to downzone a large portion, as Esther was saying, of the West Urbana area, and as part of the package in this forward vision, to provide some areas where people could do some of the investment that we had so much pressure for. So the areas where we did provide those choices included the zone of B3U, most of which is well west of Lincoln and north of Greene. That was a concession zone, if you will, that provided plenty of development opportunity for apartments to serve the campus. And it's been, gangbusters ever since in that, tremendous amount of construction and value added for those property owners. Also, we created the B2, that's a smaller zone, that's our arterial business, and we created the MOR. So the MOR was an exchange for the downzoning, which was upheld by the appellate court, the downzoning. So this is a forward-thinking progressive plan that lawfully did downzonings of a massive number of properties in Urbana and has been upheld. So we should be proud. I think we should be proud of the design review and of this forward-thinking plan. 91, the properties were rezoned pursuant to the plan. Charlie would remember how difficult that was for the council to go property by property. It was really, some of you others might remember this too. It was a big deal, but a lot of work went into that, and the job was done. Then the MOR was established. We amended the text in 1998. And for many years, we had the staff site plan review. So you'll see on your list of cases, you'll see the types of cases that the site plan review committee covered. And then the development review board was established, as I showed you, in 2003. We adopted the guidelines for them in 2004. And then we made the amendments to eliminate any administrative variances and to enhance the adaptive reuse provisions in 2009. So when you have this long history, 2009 feels like just the other day. But, there's been a slow progression of cases. Here's the map, kind of the critical map from the downtown to campus land use plan. And you can see how carefully this area, this whole part of Urbana was planned. This is a parcel-specific plan. Those are unusual to see such care taken by a community to go parcel by parcel. And one thing I should mention for Lincoln Busey, we enhanced the R7 too. So this was a huge undertaking by the city of Urbana. Here's a little bit more on the amendments that have occurred in the MOR. So we had the staff site plan review from 90 to 2003. Folks reviewing, Public Works, Building Safety, the arborist, the planner. We amended to involve the outside board 2003, adopted the guidelines 2004, first design review process in Urbana-Champaign. It's been followed by many others, including Lincoln Busey, Historic East Urbana, and now working on the downtown in Urbana. So it's been a successful model for us to improve development. Champaign never had this, but now they do. So we were groundbreaking, and I think that we were the first among the downstate communities as well. And by the way, design review is explicitly allowed in the Illinois Constitution as a zoning activity. And I mentioned the 2009 amendment as well, and just to provide even more incentive to do the adaptive reuse. So, has it been successful? Well, I think there's been quite a bit of success. I'm sure that there's more that can be accomplished. Some of the positives, we have a public process for the zoning compliance and the design review. It's a public process with the appointed board, public meetings, public notice, so that's good. That's more transparency. We have an expert MOR board. I talked about all the expertise, resident stakeholders, the architects we have, the developers, people who are knowledgeable about construction. That's who you want looking at these designs. The commercial uses are present. They've always been present, but there's a limited number. And I was just thinking tonight as we heard comments earlier, you know, why hasn't that grown? Well, one thing, if you notice, kind of the east side of Green Street, we've had the greatest amount of the office-type uses. It's a great location if you want to be in kind of a small-scale office setting, you know, attorney's office or, you know, a social worker or things of that nature. It's really a great place to be. So I think we'll always have that, and I think they'll continue in that kind of small-scale office use. I don't think that we're going to see a lot of home adaptations to higher intensity commercial uses. It's awfully difficult because of parking, building code requirements, but we do have some of those. I think the knit store is not in the MOR, but that is something that could be replicated. But you need visibility, and I think Springfield's a good location for that. So I think it's partially successful in terms of allowing those commercial uses. I think it's an important part of our downtown to have those offices and residential appearing structures on Green Street. New construction definitely has been limited in size and scale before and after the MOR. It's a palpable effect on Green Street. Green Street would not look the way it does now if it wasn't for the MOR. The new construction is of higher design quality and compatibility than it would have been without the MOR. All the details, the fences, the plantings, the patios versus porches, I mean, the materials, the whole layout that comes under this public review. And the adaptive reuse is occurring. It's of high quality, and we've had, since the 2009 amendments, we've had more of that. Here is, Esther mentioned the Campus Oaks development, and I've got, you know, other photos actually show it as being even more massive than this conveys, but you can see it's like several lots. It really changed the whole character of that block. It's a very large building. It changed the whole character of Green Street. And I don't know if it's, you know, offensive in other ways, but it was just too big. So the MOR, and apparently downtown to campus, there was a reaction, whoa, you know, this was a wake-up call. This one, I think, is more in the Lincoln-Busey area, and we have worse examples, but this shows you how important window placement can be in entrances. So this is not a very residentially compatible look when you have a largely blank facade and no entrance. So these were some of the things we were working against, the scale here and some of the design features in that example. Here are some of the things we wanted to promote. These are older, small apartment buildings on Green Street. And it's always interesting to see how, if only we knew now what we used to know, but we seem to practice a very high level of design and planning in the early part of the 20th century. And we have some great examples of that in some of our older neighborhoods in Urbana. So, you know, I know we have current codes and expectations, but these are very handsome structures and still very viable many decades after they were constructed. Here are some of the business uses that I mentioned, and I do think they're viable. And they have continued in business use, some of them for many years. This is where Timothy John's is, and I believe that this was built as a commercial building. I've asked the folks there in the past, but I don't, you know, it really looks like it could be a house, so it's possible it was converted at some point, but this precedes the MOR. And this is another one, and then I think Eric might have mentioned, or Danny, I think, mentioned the thrift store on Elm Street. And that's a church that owns the thrift store. So that's a beautiful old building that they've been able to use in a non-residential manner. Okay, Esther Pat, I believe, had mentioned the Hunziker house. This was an MOR, new construction. And this was before the MOR board. But it became our model when we wrote the guidelines. This became the best example to show people, well, this is really what we want in the MOR. We want an entrance, we want articulation of the building, we want a variety of materials, we want natural appearing materials, and we were after small apartment buildings with a big house look. This was our best example at the time. We now have I think this is 611, this is the bar property that was mentioned earlier at Kohler and Green. And again, they took it to heart. They had had earlier denials for rebuilding here, and they went back and they tried again, and they upped the design, and this was a beautiful building for them. It was the lounge area, I know, is dedicated to Mrs. Barr, the mother of the developer. Felt so strongly that they wanted to make just a standout property in her memory. And it's a very, very handsome apartment building that is limited in scale. And then came the Cochran property, which also very attractive, limited in scale. It is, as Esther pointed out, a little taller, but again, the use of the natural materials. And if you think back to some of our examples from the early part of the 20th century, maybe this is the best we can do today in following that. Here's some examples of major adaptive reuse. So these, and this one looks new, but I've been told that it was actually a renovation, but these were majorly renovated. This one is important to show because this was a huge problem property for us. This was a Ramos property. It was empty, it was in disrepair, it was just a horrible problem for the city. It was a horrible attractive nuisance. We were getting complaints constantly. We were, through a lot of effort on the city's part, we were able to push for the necessary change of ownership in this case, and then ultimately it's been renovated into an attractive building, which, you know, and I know folks who lived in the area watched the deterioration. So that is pretty amazing transformation. So this zone has been strong enough to bring us back from the brink of a problem property. This was the another adaptive reuse that this is Rich's house right here, and this is the one where it was tricky to do the adaptive reuse. This was what caused us to remove the administrative variances because they were controversial. But when you're trying to accommodate things like handicapped access, you run into setback limitations. So those are some of the obstacles in trying to work with these older buildings. Here are less extensive adaptive reuses more recently. They don't have the addresses, but they're it's beautiful work has been done, investment made in these homes on Green Street. And this is exactly what the MOR encourages, that these folks were able to get just administrative review. They got guidance from our guidelines, but I think they did an excellent job there.
Are these rental, these last two?
Yeah, those are rental. Yeah. There are not too many owner-occupants on the Green Street corridor. Steve Ross would be one. He spoke last week. So, before we move to Lincoln Busey, yeah, what's next?
Did anybody want
Well-
to ask questions on the MOR before we moved on? Dennis?
So my, having received also a comment from Alice Novak, one of her concerns that she raised was that that while, of course, we want to see adaptive reuse and economic, economic development within these districts, she feels, of course, she's the head of the Historic Preservation Commission. She feels that that the real question is whether we actually have a real conversation about historic preservation in these areas, and will the, I guess my question, maybe I'm going to add a thought about this, is that in the determination about what's the best approach to handle the sustainability of the old neighborhoods that have great value to the community for context of historical growth, is it better to let demolition and development guide the next step to see these properties transformed, or are we really trying to preserve the buildings in a way that the adaptive reuse respects the original structure of the house? And I guess for myself, I'm wondering whether wouldn't it be possible to preserve the buildings in the corridor very much as they appear, and make the incentives ones which restore the building to its newer appearance rather than to transform them, adding additions, bump outs, realigning entrances so that they become basically new buildings sitting in an old footprint.
I don't know if that was a question. Maybe I could try to rephrase it. How would we use zoning to encourage different incentives? And what tools do we have as far as encouragement and incentives?
Well, we've modified, in 2009, we modified to encourage adaptive reuse. So you have, that can be adjusted further. We dance a thin line, of course, with the property rights. We've already, in that grand vision many years ago, we had a vision that's been sustained by the courts. So I think we need to stay with that spirit. I think that we are dealing with the rights of folks who own property, after all, within the MOR. It's a small zone. So Those are, probably the most important stakeholders. Again, we've amended this zone many times. There could be further amendments. I think what we're trying to do is use the zoning tools that encourage preservation but still provide development rights. Now, if you wanted to preserve things as they were, you could go down the path of an historic district for this area. That wasn't the vision of the downtown to campus plan. But there's a process for that. There's a process for conservation districts. Would there be 25% of the property owners in support of a preservation district? Probably not. They're mostly investment properties. So I think, and, I don't know, I can certainly think about it. I mean, you could reduce the 15% or increase it. You could change the composition of the board. I mean, you could, things like that. You could just further modify the text if the council and wants us to look at discouraging the extensive adaptive reuse.
And can I say that, I guess my thought is that in our conversation tonight, we've already rather recognized the fact that the more appropriate place for new construction and business and office use has apparently been identified as Springfield Avenue. And if that's true, is it worth having a conversation about then trying to use Elm Street and Green Street more as a conservation area respecting the older aspects of the buildings and just really focusing on maintenance and creative reuse in context of the building as they appear, and use Springfield Avenue as the corridor of change, business, accommodation, and expected commerce.
Aaron?
So my question, Libby, was in relationship to compatibility, and you spoke to this a little bit, and I'm really, I'm still concerned about, after all the vote and all the discussion the other night, last Monday, about one of the concerns that from some of the constituents was what this 611 was going to look like when it was all said and done. So after the MOR and after the Planning Commission and stuff like that, they see the project. Who determines what compatibility is at that point?
It's a development review board, which Danny Otto sits on. So we did an analysis which we presented, and I would have to apologize if the staff report was not to his liking. I didn't pick up on that, but I think that's an important comment to make and something that we can look into providing, more straightforward staff reports. So yeah, they've got all the architects. So we present an analysis that they go over in quite a bit of detail. I do think they do a good job. And then there's an appeal process, which I think goes to the zoning board. So usually in these dealings, you have, if you're not satisfied, you have a venue to appeal a decision.
So you're talking about the residents who live in the area who are concerned about the compatibility of the new proposed development. They have the opportunity to appeal what has agreed.
Or the owner, if the owner didn't get the approval, then he or she could also appeal.
But it's specifically as it relates to the individuals who were not supportive of the new development. Now it's going to go through. Do they have some say-so in what it looks like when it's done?
Well, just like City Council, they have a hearing, so they hear all the input, And everybody's noticed, just like any zoning case. And at the meeting at 6:11, they spent a lot of time, as they should, on the boundary line between the Ricker House, and I see the owner of the Ricker House, who would be adjacent, is here, and he had real concerns about the plantings and the fence. And these were things that ideally would have been, accommodated ahead of time, but the DRB saw, well, here's some unresolved issues, and I think that they were very successful in asking for further work to be done to satisfy the neighbors' concerns, even going so far as to say, this is the fence that we want. This is the fence he would like, and this is what your condition is. I think that's appropriate.
So my last question was in relationship to one of your slides where you showed that I think the same developer put together an apartment that looked very similar to the house next door. Even, just like the same height of brick, and then it was siding at the top and stuff like that. I don't know. It's in one of the.
Maybe it was the same picture?
712. Was that what it was?
Sometimes I have two pictures of the same building, so I wonder if that maybe.
It was one of the first ones before. It's before this one. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You're yeah, that's a good observation.
So I see sort of the brick facade in the front, and then as it goes up, it turns into more of a siding and stuff, sort of very similar to the house next door. Is that something that, if the houses on the block, for instance, are 60% brick houses, would we suggest to the new developer that they have to have a facade that's similar to that? I thought I heard you address that to some degree, but I thought I'd give a scenario for further clarity.
I think we do. I think that's important. We actually emphasize that more in the Lincoln-Busey corridor. The Lincoln-Busey corridor had a different purpose. So the MOR corridor is, it's just a whole different idea. We're providing a lot of use and restricted redevelopment. It was more about the size and the scale and the quality of the development. Lincoln-Busey is more residential area. There we were concerned about compatibility with existing structures. We did a different type of design guideline there.
But the MOR speaks specifically to being compatible to the current structures also, right? That's what I just read. Scale and intensity and design.
Yeah, it talks about
and
kind of later, it says
to be
constructed to be
compatible
compatible
with
with existing structures in the district. And I think in the Lincoln-Busey, we were looking more like zooming in on right in that area.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Eric?
I wonder how the 0.7 floor area ratio was arrived at, and whether you feel that that's optimal, or that there's room to reconsider that or to tweak it in the light of the development that we've had.
Well, it's not really 0.7 because you can only put it onto 8,500. So the best question is, I've shown you examples.
Right.
And so it's just under 6,000 square feet is what we're talking about.
Right.
35 feet. FAR is awfully important for developability. We would be eroding the development rights to reduce it. Could we do that legally? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, we've kind of been tested once on this. I don't know what the appetite is for further.
What is the FAR of, let's say, down Elm Street, number of rental properties? I'm sure you don't know this off the top of your head, but maybe a ballpark, or maybe we could, learn that number.
Here, I can.
What the FAR of existing structures, existing older structures?
Existing houses? What?
Well, for example, the example that we've talked about a lot is 611 West Elm, but there are other there are other old properties like that, properties with older houses on them that are down Main Street. And I just, my question really is getting at how much of an expansion of floor area is the point, is the restriction that's in the MOR over what's already there. So we know that reused existing structures or can be expanded up to 15%, but I'm thinking now about tear downs.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the potential expansion in size if of tear downs of older structures in this area?
I think I'm still not understanding your question. Maybe, are you asking what is the FAR of a typical house on Green Street?
Well, yeah. I mean, for the floor area at 611 West Elm is going to go up by a factor of how much? It's maybe 3 or 2?
2.5.
2.5. Okay. Is that typical of what could be expected if there are other tear downs in the area?
You know, it would be typical of a regular single-family lot. And the lots on Green Street are a little bigger than Elm Street,
Mm-hmm.
and we can assume they probably maximized it. So, yeah, I think that's probably typical. Now, these buildings, this one probably exceeds the 0.7,
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing. But it pulls it off because of, you know, just the design.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give you some points of reference, R5 is 0.9. R4, which is our lowest multifamily zone, is 0.5. But remember, there's not a lot area limitation like we have in MOR.
Right.
Some other zones, B3 is 4. So we're like 4 plus times our commercial areas. B2 is 1.5. That would be along Springfield. So, you know, we do have more intensive zoning along Springfield and B2, but the lot configuration doesn't really lend itself to a lot of redevelopment. That's one of the obstacles on Springfield. B3U, the sacrifice zone, if you will, for the downtown to campus is a 4. I mean, for apartment buildings, people really like that. If you would go over to Champaign, though, they're like in a whole other set of numbers over there. They're much, much higher, as you can see. So Urbana really has very modest FARs. We don't allow very tall or big buildings. But even what we were previously allowing on Green Street was too much for the community. So that's why we tinkered it down to this fine a grain. So I think, maybe to answer your question, that was probably calculated to provide, you know, the minimum amount of FAR to build a small apartment building.
Okay, so it was sort of, and maybe, you know, maybe we can get some memory of people who were actually instrumental in creating it, and defining that. But your impression is that it's kind of the threshold of developability.
It could be, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Could you take the chair for a minute, Dennis? I just want to make a couple comments.
All right, Bill Brown.
Thanks. So first, thanks for presenting this on short notice. This was my suggestion to ask for a presentation on the MOR districts, especially because we had so many comments about MOR when we were considering historic preservation that we really couldn't consider when we were actually thinking about whether the building was historic or not. And I didn't know if the comments in general were accurate, so it's really helpful to go over this. And in much more detail than I expected, but it is very good, and thanks for spending your whole weekend putting this together.
It's all in here.
You're dumping it from your brain. So I guess it's up to the committee whether they want to keep going with the Lincoln BC corridor, since we do have more on the agenda, and up to you if you want to keep presenting. But I did just want to make a couple comments on the MOR. Some of the comments that we received had to do with how you encourage things by zoning, and I was kind of trying to understand that a little bit better earlier. I mean, I think our only tools really are economic encouragement. You try to make things more economic for people to do one way or another, and then you hope that they, you try to fix it so that the thing that's most economic for them is what you want to see happen in the corridor. And some of that involves probably some increased density, and our population as a city has increased since 1930, so we would expect hopefully to increase some density near downtown in order to keep it, in order to keep people coming downtown and keep the density there. So if you just wanted to preserve things as it was, I'm not sure what the economic incentive that we could offer would be unless we had some extra money and wanted to throw money at it as a historic preservation district, or offer tax incentives or something like that. I'm not sure what the incentive to a private developer would be to fix up a house, other than there have been some reuses as bed and breakfasts, and as the Backseas have done pretty well with rooming houses and things like that. So I think there's some market for that, but it's kind of limited. I don't have any ideas on how to improve that, but I'm just I'm glad you could explain this for us in a little more detailed way. Diane.
So when several people, well, more than several, last week talked about the intent of the MOR, and there were actually many different interpretations in terms of how people remembered the intent. But do you happen to know if, when this was formed, one of the intents was to increase owner-occupied residence in the MOR? Because if that's the case, that hasn't happened. So was it a, and then there were some allusions to residents being single-family homeowners versus residents being renters, and there's, renters are residents as well. So was the intent to encourage owner-occupied homes in this district?
Well, I think in the downtown to campus plan, the downzonings would have been more about lowering the zoning, and one outcome would be more owner occupants, less rental. But I don't think it's not to say we prefer owner occupants to renters can be a little bit discriminatory. But I think I think the downzoning in the rest of West Urbana was really trying to stabilize the neighborhood, to discourage the tear downs and rebuilds with apartments. And just by nature of the downzoning, you would have more security for owner occupants.
Well, I'm talking specifically about the Green and Elm.
And along Green, I don't, when Esther and Charlie were on the spot, I don't recall that was a purpose or something that really went into this corridor. I think there was really a vision of kind of these wonderful boutique renovations along Green Street, and that's one of the disappointments for some folks. They remember this vision that wasn't fully realized.
Well, that's where I kind of hit the wall, because we have this vision of maintaining these older homes, but they're not going to be occupied for the most part they're not occupied for the most part by families. So we're trying to fit a rental model into what used to be the homeowner occupied building. So how in the future do we move forward with this district to, if we want to preserve these buildings, do we make the business model fit? Of the rental business model fit? What, and that's, I don't know the answer to that, but that's what we're trying to do in this area at this point with the MOR.
Yeah, I think we're trying to have it all. We do have successful
Exactly.
owner-occupants
Yeah.
on Green Street. It's a challenge to own a home on a busy street with a mix of uses. But we have some, beautiful owner-occupants, and we have a ton of the investment rental. And, as I was trying to show, hopefully those are in better they look better than they did prior to the MOR. And we also have some successful businesses. So I don't know that we can change the market so that more people want to put their offices there, because there's constraints.
I don't have any hopes that I'm not sure we should even try. I don't see that happening. I mean, people are telling me, for example, they'd love to retire and buy a condo near downtown Urbana so they can walk to campus and walk to downtown, but banks won't finance condo development. I mean, that's a fact. You cannot get a loan for condos. And retirees are not going to move into an old house because that's what they're moving out of, and they're tired of trying to maintain it. They want new, nice places to live. So how, I see a market for a different age group living in Green and Elm as well, and who would love the walkability to campus and downtown. And I'm trying to figure out where are we going to put those folks? But anyway, I don't know. There's no answer to my question. But
some of the apartment owners have geared more towards adults. Most are, because it's so close to campus, they've got a lot of students. But here's one where you do have adults, and then we have other examples.
But these are
upper
apartments,
house.
they're not condos, right?
They're apartments, right?
Yeah. So, if we could promote condo development, there'd also be at least owners there, perhaps owner-occupied. But anyway, I don't know where this is going. But thank you for all the information. It's been very helpful.
Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, this is just one last question. So one of the concerns that have surfaced in our discussions, and partly Danny Otto also mentioned this, was that it was very difficult to address a plan which had already been developed to a high degree by an architect and developer with assistance of city staff before it actually comes to the MOR review board. So there's a certain reticence to criticize because there's hardly anything you can do about it anymore. The guy's already spent, a couple thousands of dollars on the project. And so Danny Otto was commenting that perhaps if there was a possibility of having this project reviewed at a preliminary state before final architectural plans were drafted, he and other members of the board would feel like they had at least some ability to make significant suggestions as to materials and size, especially size of the building. So is it possible to include a preliminary review before final approval it comes before the MOR that is a public process where people in the neighborhood or also the board commissioners would have early input rather than late input? Can we add that to it? One of the things that you suggested was that what's available to the developer, not so much the citizens, is a rapid review so that progress can be made on the development itself. How do we bring transparency and a voice of the community to bear at an early stage before final plans are made?
Well, remember, this is development by right that's subject to design review, and that's what that is. We bring forward the best recommendation to the DRB, and if they want to modify it further, they should. They shouldn't feel constrained, and I did not pick up on the constraint. I attended the meeting, and it didn't keep other commissioners or board members rather, from conveying, their concerns and their changes. They could always continue, and, we want them, that's their job. We want them to do that. But there's a lot of work that goes up to that point, like months' worth of work, which is the day-to-day work of our office, in improving the proposals, because we don't really want to bring things forward with a negative recommendation. We don't want to bring things forward that aren't compliant with the zoning ordinance or the building codes. And we really discourage things like variances. So we do our very best on a project, but, the work is rarely complete. And it's no guarantee of any approval. And, it's not like, a major campus it's just the architectural designs. They can be modified. They don't have all their building plans, or, they're not vested, in other words. They're trying to get their design approval. So that's the way it should work. For a PUD, we do have that two-step process. Come in with a more concept plan, so you don't invest too much, and then come in later. But those are for larger and more special projects, and you're asking for a lot of the government for a PUD. You're asking for variances and changes in use, and you're asking to work, in concessions, so you would undergo that multi-step process. We do improve the projects. You would not believe what you don't see. It's sometimes not very good. So what we bring forward, we really encourage the best that we can. We try to improve, somebody has a variance, we try to whittle it down. And I think that's one reason sometimes people say, oh, the staff is always recommending 4. But, oftentimes there are some bad things that if they don't, it's improved. That process should improve it further. I would be disappointed if we went through a process like that where it wasn't further improved.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to suggest that we hold off on the Lincoln Busey.
I don't really have much of substance on Lincoln Busey. It was mostly on the MOR. So you have the legislative history there. I was just going to show you the location. It's interesting because it is reflected in our comp plan, and it's taken directly from the downtown to campus plan. So people feel so strongly about the zoning designations in this corridor. And these are the folks on the design review board. Here's where we have vacancies. So, if there's concern about transparency, public input, we can suggest that folks apply for these positions. And here's some of the negative influences on Lincoln Busey. And then here are some things. It's been a much less active zone. Mostly these are very small modifications that have been reviewed administratively. Often with the chair's assistance, just like we do historic preservation certificates of appropriateness. The chair takes the lead, and we provide that information to the chair. So,
Libby, can we get a copy of your presentation?
yeah, I can email it to you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's see, where's my agenda? Oh. So next we have an update from the mayor on legislative proposals. Mayor Pressing.
We met with our legislators, people from Urbana, Champaign, Rantoul, Mahomet, and Savoy, and the county, and talked with Carol Ammons and Scott Bennett, Senator Scott Bennett, and Senator Chapin Rose. And these are the things that we went through with them. And what I'd like to do is very briefly discuss these things and see if there's a willingness on the part of the council to maybe back a resolution, because I think that maybe local governments have to speak up at this point when the state doesn't have a budget and come up with some suggestions. We found that a coalition working on the Mahomet Aquifer issue, for example, was extremely successful. So I just want a brief idea from you whether you want to support something like this. There's a common problem with the funding for 911 and also the gasoline tax, that these are proposals that were voted on decades ago, and then technology and inflation have eroded the funding source, and so we run into problems. On 911, our county voters approved $1.50 a month over 20 years ago. The state last year overrode this with a statewide rate of 87 cents. And that's half of what our voters approved. Of course, when our voters approved it, cell phones were not the major, they weren't even, maybe not even invented at that point. So anyway, I'd like to see us come out and say that we'd like the legislature to allow counties that had a voter approval to at least use that amount. So can I take a straw poll? Does anybody think that's a
Any
reasonable idea?
Comments on that, Eric?
So I have a question. Are you asking for approval or a resolution that would both increase the rate or have the rate be what our voters would approve if it's higher than what the state has, and also extend the surcharge to cell phones? Those are the two things that you're
Right.
asking.
Well,
Okay.
not just cell phones, but any form of communication that could get through to 911, because there are other things that could be invented.
Oh, okay, so
Yeah.
for example, if I use the phone app on my computer.
Sure,
Yeah,
right.
Okay, yeah.
And that's in the existing law, I think,
Right.
the 87 cents. But 87 cents isn't really going to help us. We've had such a huge shift over the last 10, or maybe over the last 5 years. You know, hundreds of thousands of dollars added to our line item for that because of the reduction in what we're getting from landlines, and because cell phones were so, it was like 57 cents on cell phones.
How would this be assessed? Would it be assessed per telephone number?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Okay. So if I had a
Well,
number.
I don't
yeah.
know how you do it for computers, but basically, you know, that's a detail I'm not ready to answer the question. But I just want to know
Right.
if you're okay with this, because then we could take it to other communities and ask them to support it, and that gives it more substance to offer to the legislature that the public's really concerned about this, or the cities are concerned about it, and the counties.
And do all the mayors in the county support this?
I don't know if all the mayors in the county support it, but I think the agencies that are paying for MetCAD support it.
Okay, which includes some of the
The county
municipalities.
and, the county, Rantoul, Champaign-Urbana, and the university.
Okay,
and-
and
yeah.
these folks are all on board.
Well, I haven't run a resolution by them, but I'd like to start with Urbana.
Okay, but you've had a discussion.
Yeah, we've talked about it at the,
And-
nobody said they don't like the
Your
idea.
impression is
Sounds
that they-
reasonable, yeah.
Okay.
So, straw poll?
Well, I just had a question.
Yeah, sure.
Diane?
So if I have 4 phones that I'm paying, 4 cell phones that I'm paying for, are you saying there'd be $1.50 per cell phone? So-
Right.
So
Compared to what people are paying on their cell phones, it's pretty small.
I'm just clarifying.
It's kind of like
what
the
you're saying.
transactions tax. No?
And does Illinois Municipal League have a position on this?
No, I'm trying to get a position by going through our county. Not everybody's in the same position in the Illinois Municipal League. Some of them don't even have systems. And one part of that bill was to consolidate, and now there's kind of backlash on that. Not in this county, because we already did consolidate, but in Cook County, there's some concern. So that particular piece of legislation is being questioned now. It went through pretty quickly, and it's a board that's been set up to kind of review this whole thing over the next couple of years. So I'm just trying to establish that we have enough of a fee on phones that it isn't a continual increase for the city. There's more going to what the original intent was of the legislation.
Aaron?
So what is the amount that we pay currently for cell phones? Is it 87?
Everything's 87 cents right now. I just
Okay.
got my cell phone bill.
So,
And you were paying $1.50 on your landline, but if we got up to $1.50, which is what was voted 20 years ago, that would cut back on the charges to the cities about $1 million
so that's
in
what
this county.
that's what I'm getting at, is that The question that Diane raised is that, for instance, I have my children on my plan, so I'm going to pay 87 times 4. I don't think that's fair for me. I mean, if we go from a standpoint of we were paying $1.50 for a landline where everybody in the family could use the landline, right? So all of a sudden now 4 different phones or 3 different phones or whatever the case may be. It could just be 2 individuals. My parents living in the house, they used to pay 1 cost, now they're going to pay 2 costs. I do agree with the amount being what the voters approved, maybe up to $1.50 or something like that. But 87 times 4 goes beyond it, and I'm paying like $3 and something now. You
Right,
see what I mean?
but
So
what's-
I would be more supportive of some sort of cap as opposed to just however many cell phones you have to pay every, for every number.
Well, we have more calls into MetCAD, so we have to hire more dispatchers. So the more phones that are out there, the more demand. So, there's no way that you can do it where everybody's going to pay less and you're going to get more service. We're at the point now that we can't really support it because we have limits on our budget. And that's why I went through this whole thing of trying to, get it pushed out and trying to get them to lower the percentage. But we can't keep this up forever because it's just out of whack.
Well,
Too
I
much
guess I'm getting
demand
at
for
the
revenue. So you
I don't know if I agree that just because I went from 1 landline to 4 cell phones that I call MetCAD more now. But I can see the need to increase the amount to at least $1.50 per household or something. I'm just saying that I don't even have a recommendation at this particular point, but I think there should be further conversations about how to address those multiple plans that don't put an excessive burden on one particular family or some families. Some people may only have 1 cell phone because they're the only person, they're a single person living by themselves, and now you have other people, like I said myself, I have 4 different phones, could be 5, right, with children and stuff like that, and I don't want to pay $1.50 for every one of those cell phones. I don't think that's right. So I have to think about some other particular approach to it to get where we need to go to address the demand and address the concern that you're raising, but I just don't think a blanket for every single line you should charge that. I don't know how we do that, but that would be my position.
How many phone bills do you get? Do you get 4?
It feels like 4.
I mean, does it if it all comes on one bill, maybe we could work
Right,
on that. But
okay.
How
Yeah,
does
one bill, it's one
I mean,
bill.
it is on one bill. Okay, so we can maybe get together and figure something out for that issue. Because
Okay.
you're probably not the only person in the state that has that concern.
Dennis?
Yeah, and I'll say right now that I don't have a cell phone, actually. But I understand that you can have several cell phones on a plan. It's, a family plan.
Okay,
And so therefore, the family plan would be billed by a single bill, but you'd have 4 users. I think
Okay.
that would be the similarity between an old landline.
okay.
And so that's the basis I think that you could do this.
That's a good
take
idea.
forward.
If I make that modification, would everybody be inclined to support a resolution?
I would.
Only if Dennis gets a cell phone.
Actually, my
Well,
cell
you put
phone,
Dennis on your plan and you'll have a cell phone.
actually, I'm on my sister's plan, but she's in Florida.
And does it count voice over internet? I just got a voice over internet phone, so where does that fall?
I think that's included in where do you get the bill?
I'm trying to get it from ITV3, but that's been a little challenging.
Okay. Well, I know that VoIP was one of the things that we're supposed to extend it to.
Okay.
So,
All right.
okay, so family plan and VoIP.
Make sure it's included.
Okay, so I will draw something up and then we'll talk about it. Okay? And then a big issue for us is binding arbitration. We had Lowenbaum Law drew up a proposal, and I've given it to IML. And the first 2 things, allowing arbitrators the freedom to fashion a compromise agreement rather than requiring them to choose only one side's offer. And then requiring arbitrators to base their decisions on a municipality's ability to pay rather than what other cities can afford. And I asked them to look at other states that are similar to Illinois. And so we're the only one that doesn't have ability to pay worked into it. And I think it needs to be, and this is not to be anti-collective bargaining, this is just to give a more fair chance to cities. And then, of course, item C here, limit the arbitrator's power to change the discipline imposed by a public safety chief to situations where there was a clear abuse of discretion. That addresses the kind of incident that we had in Champaign, where the chief fired a police officer, and then an arbitrator reinstated the person. So I think that takes away from the local authority to see the situation and come up with a reasonable answer. So I've asked the city attorney, Fred Stavens from Champaign, to draft something on that. And he talked about it at the meeting with our legislators. So I'd like to have all these three things in the legislation, and I'd like the blessing of the Urbana City Council to go forward. Yes?
Dennis?
Yeah, I'm totally for this, and I'm wondering, it seemed like when we were having conversations, when we were in arbitration and listening to the results of our lawyer in arbitrating with various staff, city staff, and police and fire department, that one of the issues that came up, and you didn't actually address it. Maybe you think you did, but I want to ask. It seems to me that there should be an item D, and this has to do with comparables, and require arbitration to be based on comparisons made of cities with similar populations, not cities of proximity with significantly different populations or annual budgets. Now, maybe you're trying to address that with the ability to pay feature, but it seems to me that one of our problems with going into arbitration was a disagreement about what are the comparables in our area to Urbana. And we were always being compared to a larger city next door to us, which didn't seem fair. We always wanted to be compared with a Bloomington Normal, but we didn't have the ability by law to direct the arbiter to pick truly fair comparables for us, and I think that should be a feature in this renovation.
Okay, that's a good point. Aaron?
Oh, Aaron.
You're calling, okay, sorry.
So I know you're just asking for discussion on these items, and I am not prepared to vote on either one of those recommendations at this point. I would like for us to be able to discuss them further before you move forward and take them out into the state.
Well, I'm not
legislature.
asking you to vote on it. We'll draw up something and then discuss it before you vote on it. This is just preliminary, what we talked about with our legislators, what's being talked about at the Illinois Municipal League.
Well, I know it's not something that's binding, but I thought you were asking.
No, I'm
taking a
not
straw
asking
poll
you
type of
for,
thing.
well, yeah, I could do a straw poll, but I got your input, and I hear what you just said.
Okay.
And it would be that I'll write up something and run it by you all before you would be asked to vote on it. And I would bring it back to a committee first.
Well, as much as I would love for the police chief's decision to have been permanent in Champaign, I don't know if I'm open to this sort of blanket proposal in item C, because I think
We'll
there could
get
be
it.
other.
Yeah, we'll get it from Fred Stavens, so you can look and see what he drew up, and if we want to change it, we can certainly change it. Is there something else?
I like the comparabilities piece, though, Dennis, to comparable cities and stuff like that. I don't know if I quite understand ability to pay. I don't know, what exactly are you talking about, wages? Are we talking about
We're talking about
settlements?
the
What are we
cost
talking
of the
about?
whole contract. There
Oh,
should be
okay.
some provision, that that city can actually bear the load. But right now, there's all this, fear of going to arbitration because somebody else is going to decide it. So we have to end up saying we're going to pay more than we can really afford just to avoid arbitration. And we ought to be able to base it really on what is our ability to pay. And somebody else can look at it and see if we're giving good numbers, but
Eric?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you were in Michigan, you might have a different sort of standard for what was reasonable to pay your police if you were in Flint or if you were in Grosse Pointe.
Right.
Or actually, let's bring it home, if you're in Urbana or if you're in Danville, because as you know, as much as we feel constrained, we're better off than Danville.
Okay.
Could that be rolled into the kind of the comparables argument? I mean, if we're not comparable cities, we should be matching our city to another municipality with the same ability to pay. It's kind of the same.
It's really hard to find exactly the same ability to pay, because we ran into very peculiar circumstances because of the hospitals, and I don't know if we could have found another city in that position. I think we were harder hit than anybody in the whole state. But anyway, the idea is to have a real measurement rather than, well, so-and-so's doing it, so you should do it. Where this really came up was in East St. Louis. They were forced to pay more for their police than because of other communities, and they had to lay off police officers because they couldn't afford to pay the rates that were in other surrounding communities. So we have a poster child for ability to pay in East St. Louis, and we have a poster child for the arbitrator changing the discipline in the city of Champaign. Okay, the other thing, protect the Mahomet Aquifer, we still need to do that. I won't go into that, but the gasoline tax is the same situation that we have with the 911 fees, that they just haven't kept up. And I asked Mike Munson to do some of the basic research, and he's handed out what the state and federal gas taxes are and when they were set. The federal gas tax was set in 1997, the last increase, and in Illinois, it was set, what year was it set in Illinois, Mike?
1990, January
19
1.
Yeah, 90. So, I mean, that's why we're having so much problem. Fred Geertz is really, he always has this flash index on the Illinois economy, and we heard him say that if we could spend enough on roads, how that would really help the entire economy. So, anybody have any feelings? I mean, we passed a local gas tax, and nobody said that they didn't like it because they knew that we were going to use it for fixing potholes.
Yeah.
Diane has a...
Yes, I'm very
Diane.
supportive of this. I would put a couple of caveats in there. Number one, that it absolutely has to be earmarked for road, bridge, and whatever infrastructure repair that we decide on, and it can't be used for anything else ever.
You mean you don't want to use it for
No
high-speed
sweeps.
rail?
Well, that's transportation. I don't want it to be used, I don't want it to be swept somewhere else and used.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's got to be protected and earmarked, and because I think when people have a tax and you tell them it's going to be used for something, and then they see that it's used for something, it's defensible.
Right.
And so we need to do that. And then, I've lost track of the other one, but that was the most important one. It just has to be earmarked for that.
I don't think they use it for anything other than transportation. I think it's used for maybe for the RTA or something in Chicago. We could find that out. I know that Chapin Rose was talking about that.
Mike?
A real quick point, the CPI since January of 1990 has gone up 86%. And if you look at the figures for how much our gas tax has gone up, receipts have gone up in those 25 or so years, it's like 33 or 34% for 1991 to 2015. And I think Bill might have a comment or two about construction costs going up.
Yep. Bill?
There's a group in Illinois. They're called the Transportation for Illinois Coalition, and it's a bunch of statewide and local and regional organizations. And their plan is to raise $1.8 billion in annual revenue, and basically a large component of how that would happen is by ending diversions of state income into the general fund. And right now, much of the state sales tax revenue goes into, if that's collected at the pump, goes into the general fund. And anyway, this group has outlined a plan for funding roads, bridges, and transit. And they're also proposing a 4-cent per gallon increase in the state motor fuel tax and a 7 cents per gallon increase in the state motor fuel tax on diesel, 4 cents on gasoline, and then some modest increases in motor vehicle registration and things of that sort. But the biggest thing is to end diversions of the state motor fuel tax and the state sales tax. Local agencies, right now, half the money that should be going to local agencies is going to, or being swept, if you will, into the general fund. And that just is something that has to stop. So this alone would make a huge impact to local agencies and almost double our income if we would do this. So I've been involved to some degree with this group. Our American Public Works Association, which I'm a member of, recently joined the Transportation for Illinois Coalition. Like I said, there's maybe 50 statewide and local regional organizations involved, but they've been sounding the drums locally and trying to get more and more people to buy into this and talking to state legislators about this.
Are they getting cities to pass resolutions?
They'd love that.
Okay.
They would love that.
So why don't you send me a copy of that,
could.
and I can use some of the information in the resolution.
I could pass
Maybe
it on.
we could just say we want to join them and get other cities to join. Get the
I'll
IML.
provide-
Is IML part of it?
No.
Well, maybe
No, they're not.
IML would like to do that.
I think they were involved a couple of years ago in thinking about it, and I'm trying to recall that there was a glitch in their involvement. I don't recall what that was. So,
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Is there a proposal as to what we would raise it to?
Well, they're saying 4 cents, which would be a help. I think it's good if somebody's got a modest proposal to go with that. And I won't go into the financial transactions tax because I think we've already heard a discussion on that. But if you're interested in it, there's quite a bit going on in terms of passing it at a national level. There was an op-ed in the New York Times, and then a group called the Tax Policy Center, the Urban Institute and Brookings Institution have a whole report on that. So if anybody's interested in that, I'll give you I'll just send out the references to it, so if you can read it. But it may not work at a state level if they can move it, but, the argument was that it's a small enough tax that it wouldn't get them to move. But when you talk about $10 billion, maybe they would pool their $10 billion.
But that's a magical number.
But it's a nice number. It's very nice. It would cover our whole deficit and give us some more money for roads and bridges.
Absolutely.
So anyway,
it?
I will draw up some things for your consideration. So thank you very much.
Okay, if there's no further business.
I had a
Aaron?
question or a comment possibly, because I thought we would have some time to also revisit what we discussed about the marijuana traffic stops and all that stuff. And I haven't gotten any information that I asked for in relationship to that. And then I thought we would have some time to discuss it today.
Okay. As I said, we don't have our statistician anymore in the police department. She retired, so we have to find somebody. We're in the process of getting someone. So there isn't anybody to actually work the numbers. And on the issue of whether we can direct our police department not to enforce the state law, you'll be getting a report from the legal department on that. So we haven't forgotten. We're just not ready to present it today.
Okay, so in response to gathering information, the chief was able to gather some information and present some information to us at the last committee of the whole. And what I'm requesting, I don't think it would require much more effort than what he put into that particular presentation, because I'm asking about those same particular numbers. So I don't think we need a statistician for me to get that information. And the other thing is, I had a question. Chief, could you answer a question for me, please? And this is in relationship to a state law, because obviously there's some misunderstanding or misnomer that I or other folks would like for you or the police department not to enforce the law. So if an individual, and I don't know if this is the same case, but I'd like to just use this scenario. If I am doing 45 in a 35 and I'm pulled over by a Urbana police officer, do they have the autonomy and discretion to give me a warning ticket for that?
Yes.
And it is a violation of state law?
Yes.
So if a person is caught with 30 grams of marijuana or less, can the police department give them a warning ticket for that?
Certainly.
So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking about ignore the person speeding or ignoring the person who has marijuana. So I'm not asking for the police department to not enforce the law. I'm asking the police department to use discretion in recognizing the disparity that exists in the enforcement of the law. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear for the public and for everyone to understand that I'm not asking you to not enforce the law.
Okay.
That's not my position. And so I wanted to just, on the record, that you could give a ticket, a warning ticket for the marijuana possession.
Yes, and as I shared last week, we take the totality of the circumstances, and again, I'm not prepared to address all of those issues tonight, as I've expressed to the mayor. It takes a great deal of time to get all that together. We were using a light-duty police officer to collect that data, and he spent a great deal of time, and now, unfortunately, he has to focus on other things because we have 2 police service representatives currently, and we're down from 6 originally. So we're in a personnel crisis, and you're asking us to do more with so much less, and I'm in a position where I'm going to have to ask the city council to provide more services to the police department if you continue to require us to provide all of this information on top of all the information that we're already required to deal with day to day. I expressed that to the mayor. The mayor said, don't collect the data. So I appreciate you putting me up here tonight, but that's the reason why you don't have the information.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Eric.
So this is, I guess, for our internal discussion, I don't know how to pursue this, but the other really interesting issue, I think, an issue that's of interest to us is what are the disposition of the charges. So people are cited or they're arrested for marijuana, then everything goes over, I guess, to the state's attorney's office. And is there a way to, what's the right way to get that information? Because what's really important, I mean, that's at least equally important, or maybe even more so, is what happens to the person who's been cited or arrested for marijuana possession down the line.
Mayor Preston.
So could you just write, maybe if you wrote a list of questions, then when we get somebody, we can get the data to you. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, there being no further business, this meeting's adjourned. Oh, one last comment from the city attorney.
One comment. The Illinois Municipal Code prohibits units of local government from basically dealing or enforcing or by ordinance in connection with DUI, whether it be, as they put it, influence of alcohol, other drug or drugs, intoxicating compound or compounds, or any combination thereof. That has to go to the state. It can't be by ordinance. And as far as the marijuana, there's a quantity threshold. The criminal statutes, or I think it's the criminal statutes provide that for misdemeanor marijuana, that can be handled through a city ordinance, as we do. And so there can be charging under state law or city ordinance, and the threshold is for shipping it off to the state. Mandatory shipping to the state is 30 grams.
Okay, thank you. This meeting's adjourned.